The Poisoned Crown, a queen's fatal vow, and the dynasty she destroyed. The year is 1568. In the grand, frigid chambers of Hampton Court Palace, a queen reigns supreme, yet she is a prisoner of her own extraordinary birthright. This is not the Gloriana of legend, the iron-willed virgin queen who defeated the Armada. This is Elizabeth Tudor, a woman nearing her mid-30s, her famous red hair just beginning to harbor threads of silver, her piercing eyes shadowed by a grief and a terror few in her court could ever truly comprehend. For decades, the great mystery of England, the open secret whispered in taverns and shouted in pamphlets across the continent, was why Elizabeth I refused to marry. Was it her vanity? Was it a psychological scar from her childhood, watching her mother, Anne Boleyn, beheaded? Or was it, as her most famous pronouncement suggested, a devotion to England that she was already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England? The true, hidden tragedy that lay beneath this famous facade was far more personal, far more immediate, and far more dangerous than any simple refusal. It was the existence of a bloodline she could never allow to flourish, a tragedy she herself was actively and ruthlessly constructing, the tragic suppression of the Grey sisters and the destruction of the legitimate Protestant Tudor succession. To an American audience accustomed to the clarity of a democratic constitution, the Tudor succession crisis can seem arcane. But in 16th century England, it was life, death, and the very soul of the nation. Elizabeth's reign was built on the foundation of the Church of England, established by her father, Henry VIII. If she died without an heir, the next in line by birthright was the Catholic claimant Mary, Queen of Scots, whose very existence threatened to plunge England back into a brutal religious war, reversing the Reformation and empowering foreign enemies like Spain and France. This fear was the oxygen of Elizabeth's court. Yet there was an alternative. Henry VIII, in his final will, had foreseen this terrible possibility and enacted the final, most crucial clause of his Succession Act. He bypassed his elder sister, Margaret's line, Mary, Queen of Scots, and settled the crown upon the heirs of his younger sister, Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk. The legitimate Protestant successors to Elizabeth were therefore the Grey sisters, Lady Catherine Grey and Lady Mary Grey. The Queen's shadow and the unforgivable sin. Lady Catherine Grey was, by all accounts, a charming and beautiful woman, the closest thing Elizabeth had to a true rival in both glamour and dynastic claim. The Queen, acutely aware of the power she held, kept Catherine close, often attending her at court. Catherine was a reminder that Elizabeth, a woman whose legitimacy was constantly challenged by Catholic Europe, had a legitimate Protestant backup. But Catherine was also a walking, breathing threat. The great secret, the tragedy no one spoke of, was that Elizabeth was determined to rule, and she was equally determined that no one should ever look toward her successor, especially not a Protestant one who might become a rallying point for impatient nobles. Her fatal flaw and the source of her deepest sorrow and cruelty was her refusal to nominate an heir, effectively holding the peace of England hostage to her own longevity. In 1560, Lady Catherine Grey committed the unforgivable sin. She secretly married a handsome and powerful nobleman, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. Why was this a tragedy? Because in the eyes of the law, Catherine had dared to act like a queen. The succession acts required the monarch's consent for any royal marriage. By marrying in secret, she not only challenged Elizabeth's authority, but produced, almost immediately, a son, a Protestant legitimate heir to the throne who was not Elizabeth's. The Queen's reaction was terrifying in its speed and severity. This was not the political maneuvering she used against Mary, Queen of Scots. This was a personal, venomous attack on a woman she knew well. Catherine and her husband were arrested and thrown in the Tower of London. What followed was a slow, deliberate torture designed to erase the evidence. Elizabeth demanded that the couple prove their marriage. Unfortunately, their key witness, a priest, had died, and the marriage itself was highly irregular. They could not produce proof. Elizabeth used this legal loophole to declare the marriage invalid and their children illegitimate. The tragedy was now legal. The legitimate Protestant succession was, by Elizabeth's own command, nullified. Catherine, the prisoner of the Tower. Catherine was kept in the Tower, where she gave birth to a second son. Her life became a relentless cycle of pleas to the Queen, which were always met with stony silence or renewed fury. Elizabeth, the champion of Protestantism, actively chose to deny the only legitimate Protestant alternative to her Catholic rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. The prison conditions, the separation from her husband, and the constant fear of execution slowly eroded Catherine's health and sanity. It was a tragedy of emotional warfare. She was not a political rival with an army. She was a woman whose only crime was loving a man and bearing a son. After 5 years of relentless imprisonment, Lady Catherine Grey died, broken, at the age of 27 in 1568. Her final words, "O God, have mercy on me, and forgive my sins, and deliver me out of this miserable and wretched world," echo the profound injustice of her fate. She was the rightful heir, a Protestant hope, yet she was allowed to die in internal exile by the very monarch who should have protected her. Mary, the dwarf, and the disgrace. If Catherine's tragedy was a bonfire, her younger sister's, Lady Mary Grey, was a slow, smoldering ember. Mary was tiny, described as a dwarf with a hunched back, and lacked the political appeal of her beautiful elder sister. Because of her physical stature, Elizabeth and the court largely ignored her as a serious contender. But Mary, too, possessed the fatal Tudor blood. Like Catherine, she sought solace and love in a secret marriage. Her choice was even more audacious and socially appalling to the court. She married Thomas Keyes, the Queen's gigantic sergeant porter, literally the man who guarded the door. He was a commoner, a burly giant of a man compared to the diminutive Mary. The shock and outrage were immediate. Elizabeth was incandescent. Mary's marriage was not only a political threat, it was a profound social disgrace in the eyes of the Queen. The tragedy here was twofold: the erasure of a life by an unforgiving monarch, and the erasure of a marriage based on genuine affection. Mary was arrested and, like her sister, imprisoned. The tragedy, however, was worse for her husband. Thomas Keyes was immediately separated from his wife, imprisoned, and subsequently died in 1571. Mary was then moved to a series of forced house arrests, enduring years of solitary confinement and poverty, reliant on the meager charity of her jailers. She was barred from visiting her dying husband and only allowed to see his body when it was brought to London for burial. The Queen had succeeded again. She had broken the second legitimate Protestant claim to the throne. The fatal epilogue, Lord Hertford and Elizabeth's end. The death of the two Grey sisters left the succession a disaster. There was no legitimate Protestant alternative. All that remained was the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and the now illegitimate children of Lady Catherine Grey and the Earl of Hertford. The irony and the ultimate tragedy is found in the life of Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. After Catherine's death, he was released, but his fate was tied to the royal tragedy. Elizabeth never forgave him and never fully released her claim over him. Decades later, as Elizabeth's long, magnificent